I can't actually. So maybe that's a good thing. Okay. I think we're ready to start. Good evening, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Blacknificent Show. My name is Keamogetse, a Black child on the rise, and I will be your host tonight. So tonight we'll be unpacking the collective emotional trauma that we all experienced during COVID-19. I think a lot of us were just at our worst points emotionally and mentally because of this virus, and I just thought it was important to have this conversation so that we can just not just heal, but just discuss this thing and move on from it. My guest tonight is a beautiful, intelligent, thought-provoking, and inventive growth coach who helps people heal from things that they're dealing with, but also deal with them and learn how to just live with their issues, I guess. Please note that she is not a mental health professional. However, I think she was fitting to have this conversation with, because if you follow her, which if you don't, you probably should, she has very thought-provoking conversations, as I've mentioned, and I think her opinions are something that we all would benefit from and could learn a thing or two from. If you do have anything, if there is anything in this conversation that triggers you, that makes you feel like you might need a professional opinion, please do so, because we're definitely not qualified to do so. However, we are going to just have this conversation with you so we can relate and just converse. That's all it is. Please allow me to present to you Miss Merlize Jogiat. How are you?
I'm well, very well, thank you. And you? In quarantine at the moment, but I'm very good.
I can imagine. I'm good too, thank you. So your bio states that you empower regular people to help, what is it? To help recognize their gifts and
Yes.
help their influence make an impact. So what
Yes.
exactly does this mean, and what does it entail, and how do you do this?
So I believe that everybody has a certain amount of impact on the world, regardless of what it is they do and how they move through this world. However, many of us don't even understand what impact means. And we move around thinking that we don't have any real connections to people or any influence on the people in our lives. So what I essentially do is help people figure out, especially people who are stuck, because I think it takes a place of becoming stuck to understand that you're not actually where you need to be, right? So what I try and help people identify is who they actually are, and then try and identify what it is they're supposed to do with what it is that they find out about themselves. And it mostly includes a lot of healing, especially a lot of childhood trauma, especially a lot of attachment issues with family. That's the only way to really understand who they are as people. And eventually they come around to understanding what their actual purpose is. I know I hear conversations about purpose quite a lot, but the true fundamental understanding of purpose is knowing that your being here and the struggles and the things that you had to go through in your life was essentially meant for somebody else. Right? And for some people, that's standing on a stage, and for some other people, it's just standing behind a desk at an office. But your impact is worth something. And if you can't understand the amount of that worth unless you understand your own worth as a person.
Okay, that's powerful stuff. I think a lot of people, as you said, they wouldn't even recognize that they have some type of potential.
Yeah.
So I think that's a powerful conversation that needs to be had. During COVID-19, I think many harsh realities, such as femicide, for example, were exposed, and a lot of socioeconomic issues such as unemployment, that's on an all-time high now, were magnified, even though we saw these things happening prior. I think not only were these issues unavoidable, but they also seem to be at like an all-time high. Why do you think this is? Why do you think that it just became such a popular thing?
You know what? I find it interesting that a lot of people are saying, oh, there's more femicide happening now. But what's actually happening is that it's more in our peripheral view, right? If we're stuck at home long enough with really nothing to do, we actually start to notice the things around us. And prior, people were too busy to really pay attention to what was going on in their lives. So they didn't really report it as often. It was happening, but it was happening a lot more silently than it used to before. I don't necessarily think the numbers have gone up. I think in the South African context specifically, femicide has really been a massive issue since the end of apartheid, if not earlier as well. And so many issues come from that. I think things like understanding gender-based violence, that it happens so silently in homes that women now that work would go and find work outside to prevent themselves from being completely exposed 24/7, right? Then there's also, I think he's gone. It's still recording. Okay, sorry. I think also the issue of unemployment, we weren't focusing on it as much because people were finding ways to get by, right? People were finding ways to make a living, to kind of feed their families. But now that we're all in lockdown, and we were in that hard lockdown last year, the opportunity to actually make a living, even if it was just a 5 rand on the street, was literally stripped away from people. And that's how we noticed how much poverty there actually is. So the numbers really haven't changed. We've just, I think society has now really gotten a different view of it because we were forced to not move anywhere for a while.
True. A lot of mental health conversations, especially, I don't know if it's just me that noticed this, but there were a lot more mental health conversations that were taking place on social media specifically. I think there were trends in the use of the words depression and toxicity. Based on your knowledge, what were the reasons, or how can we explain, like, just again, the trends of just mental health being such an important conversation during this time?
Yeah. So I listened to a very interesting conversation with Dr. Ramani yesterday, talking about how mental health now seems to not be as taboo as it used to be before, when in fact it still is, because it's taboo to the people who are experiencing it. The fact that we are talking about it on social media doesn't necessarily mean that we are covering all of the issues within the mental health bracket, if I can put it that way. We are more vocal because we have social media at our disposal. But what I'm finding, especially with influencers on social media, is that the conversation around mental health is not necessarily to direct people in a direction that will help them, but it's more now focusing on the fact that they had mental health issues that they weren't aware of to begin with. And being in this lockdown obviously highlighted the fact that they were dealing with things that they had never really looked at. There was just too many other things happening on the side. The conversation is not necessarily being steered in a helpful way. There are so many things that need to be done in this space, and we can talk about it all we like, but it might make someone feel seen for 5 minutes. But if you count the demographic of South Africa, so many people don't have access to mental health care. It's next to impossible to get. If you're doing it in the public sector, you're really waiting months and months to even get the real help that you need. So essentially, the conversations are not doing as much as they should. And what I find is that the people who are talking about mental health on social media, if you reach out to them, they don't themselves have the tools in order to direct you or help you. So I feel like if we need to be talking about it, it needs to be the people who have the tools who can direct and help these people in their time of need. I'm not surprised that the suicide numbers have gone up in the last year and a half. People just don't know what to do and don't have the coping skills. And the internet can give you all the information that you want. But from someone who started at ground zero, learning that information is hard if you don't even understand what they are talking about.
It's true. I think, for me, well, as I'm speaking from a personal perspective. I think people were rather exposing or just vocalizing what they were going through and understanding or realizing rather what was happening. But as you're saying, I don't think any of us understood what was happening to us, but we just knew that there was a problem. How do you think that conversation can be changed? Do you think it's a matter of us then seeking, because as you're saying, professional help is hard to get, not everybody has access to it. How do we then lead the conversation the right way?
I think we lead the conversation in the right way by highlighting the issues that people may be facing, the issues that we are facing ourselves, but then also how we are getting help. I don't know if you've noticed that a lot of the people who are talking about mental health issues on social media don't necessarily say, oh, and I'm seeing a therapist, and this is what my therapist is helping me with. You know what I'm saying? You need to kind of normalize the idea of therapy. It's very important. What the taboo and the stigma is still around actually going to someone to share your feelings, right? And in an African language, landscape, it's kind of like we trained ourselves to be embarrassed that we actually have feelings and that we're not supposed to share them with anyone. We're strong enough to cope. The truth is we aren't. And this narrative that we keep telling everybody, especially South African women, is that you're strong enough to get through everything, is actually exacerbating the mental health issues, because she doesn't realize the layers of issues that she's dealing with all at the same time. As a single mom, dealing with COVID, losing her job, there's so many layered issues going on. So we can't be surprised when we see that the depression numbers are going up. We need to be responsible in these conversations. And the most responsible thing we can do is, if we're having a mental health issue, presenting to people the fact that, okay, look, I'm going to therapy. I'm being open with you about it. I'm learning tools. I can give you some of the tools if you can't get therapy, but I can also direct you in a way that can help you get therapy that doesn't cost you anything. But it's necessary, and stressing how necessary it is. There really isn't another way to deal with it unless you're doing the emotional work on your own and you have some emotional intelligence on your own, which is really difficult for most people to get to. We have to be responsible, especially as social media influencers, to teach people that it's okay to get help, and help doesn't make you look weak.
Okay. I think that's powerful. As we've established, Uguti, lockdown was emotionally taxing on all of us. I think for me, the hardest part was you're forcefully made to face your demons. As we've said, you can't distract yourself, you can't run away, there's no escape. You're in the house, you're alone in the same four walls, and your thoughts and your emotions are coming back. Like you just can't ignore them, I think, or my question rather is, was this lockdown necessary in terms of it being an enforced step to recognize that we have mental issues or emotional issues?
I honestly, from my personal point of view, I think it was. This is the thing. For years, I've been saying to friends of mine that there needs to come a time where we start to really see the truth for what it actually is, as opposed to this busyness around us distracting us from what's going on. And what I meant by that was, we all have demons, right? All of us are dealing with personal traumas. All of us are dealing with life experiences that have somehow impacted us and the way that we move in this world. And if we don't ever get to the place where we reckon with those things, we don't essentially get to the place of our lives that where it's satisfying and fulfilling, and we have fulfilling relationships and we understand ourselves. For most people, they never get to that point. And I think COVID was necessary in order to help us face our demons. The problem is our society is not prepared for what that meant, right? And we see that all over us all the time. South Africa is so focused on racism and focused on corruption and focused on the government that nobody is really taking a deep dive into why our systems are not functional enough to allow our people to really find themselves in a place of real, actual healing. We are dealing with generational trauma passed on from all of us. All of our families at some point were one way or the other involved in apartheid, right? That is generational trauma that is passed on through the womb. We are now carrying their trauma, and then the trauma that was inflicted on us by our parents and the people in our lives. The moment we got silent, they were in our faces. But this is also the reason why femicide is all in our faces, because that is trauma that isn't dealt with, that is given to other people through violence. There's really no other way to look at it, right? And it was necessary. But this is the problem that I'm really finding right now, is because we weren't prepared for what was going to happen emotionally to our people, because we don't want to talk about our emotions, and we don't even believe emotions exist in the greater scheme of things realistically. A lot of people have literally fallen off the cliff at this point. And all I've ever seen in the last couple of months, and at one point I was one of those people, was how terrible our lives are because the government is doing this to us. Not recognizing the government, number one, just wants to protect us. But now, because they are not equipped to deal with your emotional needs and you're dealing with your trauma and your healing needs, that is 100% your responsibility. But we're not going to have that conversation, right? Because having that conversation means you are telling me that I am the one who's inflicting A, B, and C in my life, and I cannot deal with that because everything else is everyone around me's fault. I feel like we needed to groom enough mental health experts, enough therapists, enough coaches in order to just hold what was going to happen in this time. But the revelations are good. And I think in this last year and a half, a lot more people have really become emotionally aware because they really didn't have a choice. I mean, they faced themselves in the mirror, and that was all there was to look at, you know? So it's a good and bad thing, I think, that it happened. And it's only a bad thing because we weren't equipped enough to deal with the people who really needed the help.
I think the only part where I might disagree a little bit is just the opinion that sometimes we do shift blame. I agree that we do shift blame a lot more than we have to. Sometimes it's harder to accept that you're the one that's holding yourself back in a lot of departments, especially in your own life and your own progress. However, I do think there are certain conversations that need to be had in terms of corruption and things like that. I think these are definitely conversations that people, I think, sometimes don't take too seriously. However, I don't know. I think we have to find a healthy balance between understanding that some people are at fault in like the grander scheme of things, but you also need to start doing something within yourself, you know?
Look, I feel like that's warranted. So I feel like that is a warranted conversation. But then again, we have to come back to the fact that the people who are permitting these crimes, are they emotionally sound people? If you're an emotionally sound person, you're not going to make dire decisions that infect a whole country or affect a whole country. You know what I'm saying? So it starts from the top, and it's really one of the conversations we need to have. But if those people are not even willing to deal with the fact that they are not emotionally mature enough to deal with what they need to handle, we're kind of telling the rest of the country that it's okay just to not care and do whatever it is you feel is okay for you at the time.
I hear you. Some people had mentioned, and it's something that you mentioned as well, for example, with issues of femicide and just gender-based violence, that their domestic situations were big contributing factors to their declining mental and emotional health. Not necessarily, you know, with romantic relationships or women and men, but I think your family, your relatives, just whoever you're staying with, I think there's a lot of toxicity that we came to not be able to avoid. Would you suggest that we use the remainder of this period? Because I mean, we're slowly returning to our norm. Would you suggest that we use the remainder of this period to find new coping mechanisms or to actually fix these relationships?
So here's the thing with toxicity, right? Toxicity a lot of the time cannot be fixed because it's fundamental flaws in people's personalities. And if you understand personality types, there are some personality types that can't be changed regardless of circumstances. I think the mistake that we make is thinking fixing relationships is going to automatically reduce the toxicity of the situation that we're in. But that is actually very unlikely because, like you've heard the saying, we can only fix ourselves, right? And when we identify in ourselves what we're doing to contribute to negative situations, how we haven't healed from past traumas, which is contributing to our current situation, and how our behavior is impacting everybody in our immediate surroundings, then it's really difficult to change a toxic situation. But there are I tell people all the time, first do the work on yourself before you identify what the toxic situation is. Because when you get to the point of identifying how you are the contributor, healing those things and then dealing with them, you start to notice if there's still toxic situations happening, that it really is not anything to do with you. And that's when you have to make a decision. The hardest thing I think I personally learned in this past year is that you will realize that the people you think are supposed to be the closest to you are actually the toxic people contributing to your life. And you can do all the work you want on yourself, but eventually the screen will be in front of you, right? And you'll be like, wait, I've done all the work. I'm monitoring my behavior. I'm really thinking through how I feel and how I behave and how I move. But this situation persists. So let me remove myself and see if I am actually the contributor. Number one, the thing is you've already done the worthy work, and that worthy work is going to pay off down the line. But then you need to make a choice on whether this toxic situation is actually good for your mental health in staying there, staying available, staying emotionally present for these people, or is removing yourself the best option. It's the hardest thing to do when it comes to people like your siblings and your parents, right? Because we have this cognitive dissonance thing going on in our heads about these people are really good people one way, but they're really toxic another way. And I have to love them, especially in a child situation. I have to love them, but they are really horrible to me in other ways. So we sit with this balance that we can't necessarily, we don't know how to make them coexist. And at that point, when you're in that, when you have to get to that place, you have to make a decision for yourself. I find that removing yourself is the best for your own mental health. It's the hardest thing to do, but there really is no fixing a situation when you've done all the work. So I always tell people, do the work on yourself first, because you can't blame somebody else until you know what's going on with you.
I hear you. Now that we're slowly returning to our norm, I think I've also noticed that people are helping on protecting their peace, but they disguise it in such a way that it's at the expense of the next person's feelings. I think
Yeah,
that's a very dangerous game to play for me personally. Do you
yeah.
think that this is a positive change, especially for people who um are struggling with depression or anxiety?
Yeah. So this is the thing about depression. Generally, when you're depressed, you're not going to look for that peace thing. You're just going to look for an escape. And most people who end up in really dark depression are not actually even communicative about what is going on. So generally, I feel like depression doesn't really speak to this so much. However, finding peace is everything. It is literally everything, but not at the expense of other people. And I think when we talk about the expense of other people, we need to be very careful about how we word that. Because if I do something to get my peace and you're offended, the question is, why are you offended? And does it actually have anything to do with me? When we really get down to the foundation of the issues here, it has a lot to do with codependency. Codependent people cannot exist without your presence. They do not know how to function. They don't understand how to manage their emotions, because essentially, if you're codepending on someone, you're codepending on them to help you manage your own feelings, because you don't have the tools in order to do that yourself. When I hear people say they're trying to find their peace, the first question I'm asking is, okay, did you recognize that there were things about you that you are allowing yourself to be someone who is being used by a codependent person, if that makes sense? Because when you get to that point, it has nothing to do with that person. Essentially, everything we do for ourselves really has nothing to do with anyone around us except us. And we need to get to a place where we realize that the impact that the outside world has on us can have such a negative effect that it drains our peace, and we need to decide what that's going to look like for us. I tell people all the time, if someone says something negative to me or is upset with me for something or feels like I have insulted them somehow, it really says a lot more about them than about me, because I understand myself enough to be morally correct in my decision making. I'm not going to do something harming to someone else just because I'm going to get something out of it. And I'm really not going to play on any necessary narcissistic personality type behaviors, because I don't get benefits from harming other people, and I'm empathetic at the same time. If I have all of those things and I need my peace, it really has nothing to do with the outside world. I know myself well enough to know what I need, and what I need right now is more important. Watch out for the people who become upset when you do that, because generally those are the most codependent people in your life.
Understandably. So I think it's the lack of empathy for me that really just tends to frustrate me, because as you're saying, there's really nothing wrong, and if anything, it's right to
Mm,
claim your own life and to want to make your peace a priority. But I think
yes.
it's the lack of empathy that I've been noticing of late, and it's almost
Mm,
romanticized when someone's like mean or harsh or rude about wanting to protect their peace, and it's like that doesn't need to happen. But
yes.
I think asserting yourself is very important.
Yeah. I feel like with the collective grief that everybody's experiencing at the same time, we're starting to see this rise of unempathetic people, because most of the time they just stuck in this trauma cycle continually, right? And it's really difficult to give of yourself empathetically to someone when you're stuck in your own cycle. I mean, I've experienced it. I've seen everyone who had death in their family experience it in the last year. But we really have to be mindful about how we're moving, and how empathy is so valuable. It keeps us human in what it is
Yeah,
we do. But even when you're having empathy and you need to keep your peace, and someone is getting upset with you about it, you really need to evaluate the relationship, because is it me who's causing this, or is this person ultimately not emotionally sound enough that everything I do upsets them because they need me for
it's so
whatever
true.
supply they're getting, you know?
Okay, I hear you. I hear you. On your YouTube channel, I think I'm not. I think I'm right here, but I think it's still new, because if
Yes,
I'm
it
not
is.
mistaken, there was like one video up.
Yes, I only posted last week for the first time.
I'm waiting on new content because I watched that show and I was blown away. I think it was as I said, I feel like your content is something that we all need to familiarize ourselves with, especially because people choose to just shy away from these conversations and people don't want to have these conversations on public platforms all the time or with people around them all the time. So I think escaping and finding our way to your channel and to your content is something it's something I'm definitely going to recommend for people going forward. But you had a talk on your first video, if I'm not mistaken, on self-awareness, emotional maturity, and emotional intelligence. Without giving away your entire conversation, what tips would you recommend for people who are looking to contribute to a better society, but starting with themselves?
Yeah. But can you give me a second? Let me just manage what's going on at the door because it's getting louder. I don't know if you can hear it.
Okay. So on your YouTube channel, I noticed your first video, which was the conversation rather, or the title of the video was self-awareness, emotional maturity, and emotional intelligence. Without giving away your entire video and its content, what tips would you recommend for people who are looking to contribute to bettering society, but starting with themselves?
I think it's first healing. Like healing is first and foremost for everything. There's really no getting to emotional intelligence or emotional awareness without understanding where your triggers lie. A few months ago, I did post a video on Instagram talking about triggers and why they are so important. Your triggers generally tell you where you haven't healed yet. And if you don't understand where you haven't healed yet, you don't really even know how a certain event or a certain someone has impacted your life. I really tell people to do the child regression activity where you go back and find out how something triggered you, who said it, did it, how it impacted your behavior going forward. Because everything as a child has impacted who we have become, right? But now who we become impacts our own children, other people we come into contact with, and how we work and the associations that we have in our lives. If we find that our relationships keep breaking down, we need to really investigate where that comes from, because generally we are all taught how to become a certain way or have relationships a certain way by the modeling in our lives. And the modeling comes from our upbringing, whoever that might be. And in South Africa, I think for the most cases, it's either a single mother or a grandmother or something like that. And their modeling comes from their upbringing. So they're just passing this thing down the line. The most important thing is to start there. You have to start with the regression. You have to start with the healing. And as time goes by, you start to realize when someone is saying something that makes you feel uncomfortable and you feel a little triggered, in the moment you'll be like, okay, this triggers me right now. Let me understand why it triggers me right now. And it becomes such a habit to do that you become more involved with how you interact around the world. That also will have a direct impact on your relationships and have a direct impact on your work relationships as well. I find that people who actually do this become emotionally intelligent over time. One of the other things that I think is also very important, and it's difficult to do in the beginning because most people don't have the kind of discourse, the kind of discourse that comes with the literature, right? Over time, you'll find that when you do this enough, you're going to start seeking more of this, more healing, more understanding, more wanting to get to know how other people function. And that's where the literature becomes important. There are a plethora of books that are vital in this area. And for starting the childhood regression stuff, I really recommend, there's a book called The Adult Child of the Emotionally Immature Parent. It will show you your parents in Technicolor and understand how their behavior has a direct impact on how and who you are today. So that for me is the number one book recommendation when you start doing the work. But then as time goes by, there's books like Chatter, there's books like what's this Oprah's book that came out a few months ago. It's brilliant. It talks so much about personality development and how we impact the world from how we grew up. Books like that are so valuable. And there's a ton of, I think, podcasts, there's a ton of YouTube videos. And then most importantly, other than going to therapy, which I feel like everybody needs to go to therapy at some point in their lives, there's a massive difference between therapy and coaching though. But you need to really invest in therapy, is finding your people. And your people 9 out of 10 times is not your family. They are the people who are drawn to you because you're starting to understand who you are. Those people usually come into your life to highlight you. Do you realize that you were triggered in this area, but you didn't necessarily process it at the time? I find that those people come to you the older you get and the more education you get. And they really, in my case specifically, I can only talk for me. In my case, I found that they saw things I needed healing from years before I realized I needed the healing. Those people are very, very important. And I can guarantee you, they are not going to be your parents.
You also did a video, but this was not on your YouTube, if I'm not mistaken. This was on highlighting toxicity within oneself. How do we identify toxicities within ourselves and stop ourselves from being the villain in the next person's story or the toxic person in the next person's life?
You know, like I was talking earlier about understanding yourself and learning to get to know yourself, it's very difficult to actually recognize the toxic behavior that you have, because it's like having to look at yourself in the mirror, seeing something you like but you can't remove and you don't know how to remove it, but then you just pretend that it's not there. I'm gonna give you two separate dynamics here. There are people who are healthy people who understand that they need to heal to be healthy people, and who are then willing, like in the book that I'm writing, to bulldoze through the path that they are on, right? Bulldoze through the big boulders in the path and then investigate the boulder that blew up. Most people don't do that. They jump over it and pretend it doesn't exist. The minute you jump over it, you're not going to recognize how toxic you are to other people. Every single person has a particular journey, and every hard part of that journey is an opportunity to recognize where you lack, where you are toxic, where you are the one who is passing pain on to your children and to other people around you. Those are the moments to really zoom in, right? Then we have the second scenario where people aren't as healthy and where they really aren't interested in being healthy because they are holding on to traumas that they don't necessarily want to actually take the walk through. And I'm particularly talking here about narcissistic people. So narcissistic people don't have the ability to see that their toxicity is impacting everybody else, because the only thing that's going on in their frontal cortex is that I need to get some sort of benefit from any situation, any which way, how. And they do it so often and so much that it really gets very difficult for them to even see that they are doing this, right? So in a healthy situation, I really just tell people, you're going to face challenges. That's inevitable. There's a reason these challenges happen. We say everything happens for a reason, but we don't actually quantify that with why. Everything happens for a reason, because every struggle brings you closer to who you're supposed to be, but will also bring you closer to how you are causing your own issues. A lot of us are replaying our childhood and our past traumas over and over and over again. We keep getting stuck in these cycles, and it's very easy to say, I'm not the toxic one, I'm doing the healing, and never really recognize that every one of us has a toxic trait. It's unavoidable. It's really unavoidable. You know, if I talk about myself specifically, I don't like to ask for help, and that is a trauma response. I need to recognize that the trauma response is not necessarily helping me, because when I need help, I'm rather just not going to say anything. Then I suffer in the long run. Those trauma responses are where your toxic behaviors exist. And by ignoring them and by pretending that they are not there, or just skipping along as though, no, everything will be fine, and I'm going to meditate, and I'm going to, go to the gym to punch out all my pain, it doesn't help you sort out the parts of yourself that are actually ruining the life that you are trying to create for yourself. Because every one of us is responsible for how our lives become. Whether it means we're staying in an actual toxic situation or we're being toxic to ourselves. We don't treat ourselves like we love ourselves. That in itself is toxic behavior. So it takes a lot of real introspection and the willingness to do that work.
I hear you. I think this conversation is a little deeper than I had anticipated. So I'm a little taken aback right now. But there's also a piece that you wrote on your Facebook on racism, corruption, poverty, violence, and also fighting the virus throughout all of this. many of us were left just feeling hopeless. And I think that was the word
Yeah.
that you used, was that we're just all in a state of hopelessness.
Hmm.
Hopelessness. Wait, I don't think I said that right. But
Hopelessness.
anyway, you got it. Hopelessness. Thank you.
Yeah.
How do you suggest that we get out of this funk and find the strength to carry on?
We need to stop watching the news. I'm just going to be honest, right? And this is coming from someone who is obsessed with the news. I have
Yeah.
months where I am CNNing and ENCAing all day, every day. But because I have
Yeah.
ADHD, so the background noise is really great for me while I work. But I really like the news because of the really interesting topics that come up. But then again, 90% of the population doesn't do what I do. I want to read between the lines, which is why I watch the news. For those who watch the news constantly and who feel that they're overwhelmed, number one. Number two, who are not sleeping well, because I can guarantee you that most of the population who are sitting in front of that news and just taking in all of the stuff is not sleeping well. For those of us who are scrolling through our TikToks till 2 a.m. in the morning, you need to recognize that you are not helping yourself. There's a real issue with technology that is really impacting our mental health, especially in a time like this, because that's all we have to do, right? We have our cell phones, we've got social media, we're watching everyone's stories, but we're not really zooming in on what it is our brain is struggling to deal with, because we're overwhelming our brain with so much information continually. Other than the emotional factors, as a human with a brain who needs certain things, we are completely ignoring the overwhelm that we keep placing in our brain. I won't be surprised that in 20, 30, 40 years from now, we'll see numbers of, senile older people go up, right? Of memory loss get worse, of brain health decline dramatically. And it's because we're on these blue screens 24/7. That is the first thing that we need to really reduce if we want to get better at just absorbing what's going on around us, right? The second thing I think is the most important thing is being present. Being present with self. How often in a day are you actually sitting with yourself, by yourself, without the need to have a conversation, without the need to scroll through your phone, without the need to be eating, because eating is a distraction as well? When are you just sitting with yourself, in your body, in your head, in your breath, just understanding that I need to just be here for me right now. I just need to be the support for me right now. We're looking for support from everybody else. We are joining support groups and we are toying on social media about something that was done incorrectly because corruption is ruining our lives. No, we are ruining our own lives. We are making that choice every day when we don't allow ourselves to be there for ourselves. I hear people talk a lot in the last year about how we are dealing with collective trauma, and how we need to deal with all the people that are struggling with family members that died. But we're not telling them, I can support you as much as I want, but there's going to be a moment when you're by yourself. Do you know how to support yourself when you're by yourself? Are you going to find a distraction to avoid those moments? Because then you're not willing to move on with your life. You just want to sit in the soot of it all, and you want to overwhelm your brain so that it doesn't have the opportunity to learn coping mechanisms throughout everything that you're going through. The only way to learn coping mechanisms, other than good modeling, which very rarely happens in our society, is to really understand that if we're not supporting ourselves, we have no way of expecting that from anybody around us.
Yeah, no, powerful stuff. We're still dealing with, I think a lot of us are still dealing with the losses of our loved ones from
Yes.
this virus, and also just clear demonstrations of inequality, poverty, and as we've already mentioned, femicide and gender-based violence, and just so much more during this period of time. I think you asked a very important question at the end of your piece on Facebook, which was, what now? Oh, sorry. What what do we do now that we've realized all of this and we've learned all of this? Do you have an answer for us?
This is actually a very important question, which is why I posted on Facebook. And you would have noticed that I didn't really get the kind of responses that I was looking for, because I I guess I'm just an optimist. I think that people are really just doing the work and the inside stuff. But it turns out people are just too caught up in their own situations to even care most of the time. But what now is when you've done the work on self, you have to do the work on the community and everyone around you. It is senseless knowing what you know without allowing yourself to impact your neighbor. It is really senseless. Then what is the point of all of it in the first place? What is the point of us fighting about the corruption and the femicide and the gender-based violence? What are we actually fighting for? Are we just making our voices heard and hoping someone else is going to step up? Or are we actually going to make the choice for ourselves that something actually needs to be done? Generally, society is not willing to actually do anything because we're all just fending for ourselves at this point, right? The problem is the more we fend for ourselves, our children are going to have to live in a world where it's 10 times worse than what it is right now, because we are teaching them that it's okay not to help your neighbor when you can, and help yourself first. And I'm not saying don't give yourself self-care. I'm not saying don't love yourself. Those are things are vital. But when you love yourself, it's so much easier to love your neighbor. And you figure out that morally, it's actually the right thing to do. I've gotten so tired of Facebook in general, because what tends to happen when these things come up is that everybody has a complaint. Everybody is moaning about something. And my question has always been, okay, you've identified that there's a problem. What are you doing about it? What exactly are you at least educating your children? Are you at least showing them what giving your neighbor who needs a loaf of bread looks like? Are you at least showing up in those ways? And I can guarantee you that most people are not. Most people are not even having the bare minimum of conversation about these things with their own children. And the reason why is they don't want to identify these things for themselves, because it means they actually have to get out of their comfort zone and do something. You get to a place with your own healing and understanding of self where that itch scratches you, right? That itch that says, okay, you know who you are now, but now you just can't sit with it by yourself. You have a responsibility to tell somebody else. You have a responsibility to help someone else. Most people don't want to do the work because that next step is way too uncomfortable for them. It's easier just to sit with my family. I'm going to go to work, come home, feed myself, buy myself a fancy car, because it's all about me. It's all about the life that I want. And everyone around us is battling just to get by. And it's really, I think it's really unfair. I mean, I live in an area where we see white homeless people, you know, and I look at them and always wonder to myself, how on earth did this happen? Because apartheid was set up to help everyone that was of, you know, that was white. Now you guys are just abandoned and left to fend for yourself. If that's what it's like after apartheid, what do we expect is going to happen in 50, 60 years if we continue going on the same road? I really am very concerned about how dire our outlook is going to look for our children.
Now I'm concerned. I don't have kids, but I'm concerned for us and just for those after us, because I know that activism is something that a lot of people just do not even have the time for, and they don't understand how simple it is to just do better, like, and not just for yourself, but for those you're leaving behind, you know. But I think that brings us to the end of the conversation. Are there any last words that you have for us?
I think the thing I always say to people, which is most important, if you're not doing the work, you're not going to have the life you want. It's just as simple as that. And other than all the other things I mentioned that come with having the life that you want, it ends up being completely worth it. It really, really does. This fabricated world that we live in, and this needing to be a particular way to look a certain way, is not going to last long. We really have to become authentic and understand what authenticity actually means, other than the way social media is labeling authenticity. Authenticity really means understanding the self, who you are, who you're becoming, and why you are becoming that. Because you don't become just for you. That is the ultimate goal. But when you become, you actually live the life you want. And a lot of the time, that really has nothing to do with money.
Powerful stuff. Thank you so much. I think I could not have had this conversation with anybody else. I'm happy with choosing you, and I think you really exceeded all my expectations. I think watching your channel and going through your content was already just a great humbling experience for me, just to be a part of your knowledge and your journey. I guess I really appreciate you honoring your invite and you coming through today. um this brings us to the end of our conversation tonight, guys. Please remember that neither me or my guests tonight are registered mental health professionals, and if you feel like you have anything that you might be triggered by from today, it's probably best that you do make contact to a registered mental health professional. In the words of our guest tonight, calling for change does not create change until we change.
Yes.
We've been through a lot over the past 19 months, and I think it's okay to take time to yourself to regroup and to heal and to gather yourself and to only show up when you feel like who you are again, when you're happy with who you are again. The change can only come when you're ready to make the necessary changes within yourself and within your environment and fit your life, you know. Please do enjoy the rest of your evening, and we'll see you again next week Sunday. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye.